Good day and welcome to the second in the series of lectures on Anglicanism in the 17th century. Today we're considering the Civil War period from 1640 to 1660 of what was known as the interregnum period for the most part in English history. Now I do realize that in the last video I spoke about Calvinism, and I believe that's a term which needs to have some unpacking. John Calvin was what I would call a second-generation Reformation theologian who was born in 1509 and died in 1564. And as a second-generation Reformation theologian, he had a great deal of influence. He was born in France. He spent a great deal of his time in Switzerland, and he was a very influential reformer. His Institutes of the Christian Religion are famous and have come down to today, originally written in Latin, but then translated in the French. And also there's an extraordinary corpus of his preaching. Now, John Calvin was one thing, but the people who came after him became what's known as Calvinists. That is, those who read his theology and then emphasized and developed certain points within his theology. Now, for instance, one of those was John Knox, who was the founder of Presbyterianism. Notice not Calvinism, but Presbyterianism within Scotland. Also, the Puritans read John Calvin and developed his theology in a particular direction that was suitable to them. So two groups, for instance, reading Calvin's theology and developing it in two different directions, both more extreme Protestant directions, I would point out. They developed it in a direction of saying that the Bible was the sole authority for Christian inspiration and for Christian living and for a Christian understanding of community, society, and government. The Calvinists stressed a great deal about God's sovereignty, God over all human affairs and over in each individual and their eternal destination. The Calvinists dwelt a great deal on the notion of predestination and double predestination, that God actively predestines people both to heaven and to hell. And also, they were very clear that their particular group, whether they be Presbyterians or Puritans or whoever, were part of the elect, those who were going to heaven, and they were absolutely assured of that final destination. As a result, they had no qualms about stressing Christian living or morality within their communities, and they knew very exactly what that was to look like. And of course, we see this in one extreme in the Puritans when they came to the New World. Also, they thought that their Christian faith and their version of it, Calvinistic version of it, was the model to design not just Christian behavior of a congregation, but of an entire community and of an entire society, including what we would refer to essentially as the secular government. It was to be ruled by this Calvinistic notion. And so that gives you some sense of the difference between Calvin, the man and the theologian, and Calvinism. That is how later people, particularly John Knox in Scotland, developed Calvinistic theology in other more extreme Protestant directions. Now, in order to pick up our story today about what was going on in England during the period between 1640 and 1660, we need to have a basic backgrounder in the English Civil War. So as I mentioned last week, in around the year 1640, there was what's known to history as the Short Parliament. And that was a parliament which the king had to call, Charles I, in order to raise funds, in order to address a Scottish invasion that was coming down from Scotland by Presbyterians in rebellion against the attempt to impose a Scottish prayer book upon the Scottish nation, and also episcopacy. And during this parliament, things didn't go Charles' way at all. The parliamentarians were in no mood to humor him, and what they did instead was they arrested his number one secular advisor and the Archbishop of Canterbury and had them both thrown in jail. In 1642, things had deteriorated again, and the Long Parliament came into effect. Charles calling it back. Notice the king has the right to call or summon the Parliament. That's something that's going to change during this upcoming period. And during this period, the Parliament wasn't doing what Charles had wanted it to do, so he went himself with soldiers into the Parliament in an attempt to arrest the 5 ringleaders of the parliamentary opposition. That is, those who were opposed to the king's program. That failed. The king had no choice but to flee London, go out to Oxford. There the royal banner was raised and civil war broke out. Now, during the period of the Civil War, the Parliament kept sitting during the long Parliament session, and initially they had to solicit Scottish help in the war against the king, and this involved appeasing the Scottish Presbyterians with the matters of religion. And there was this root and branch petition brought to the English Parliament, which wanted to root out the prayer book, episcopacy, and all remnants of Romanism from the English nation. And that's the root and branch petition. And this had Presbyterians butting heads against a new religious grouping that was developing within England, known generally as the Independents. People thought about independent congregations, and they were going to become much more important within the history of England. In 1645, the parliamentary forces, at this time led by a fellow by the name of Oliver Cromwell and his new model army, new men professionally trained, were very successful, and they won a series of victories and defeated the king. In 1648, the Parliament continued to sit, but there was a colonel who came into the Parliament, a friend of Cromwell's, and he expelled many of the members of Parliament which didn't agree with him. And this produced what's known as the Rump Parliament, R-U-M-P. Now, the Rump Parliament continued for a number of years, and then in 1653, Cromwell himself expelled even the Rump because they weren't behaving the way that he wanted them. And he became Lord Protector of the realm, sort of an office much like a military dictator, in the realm until he died in 1658. And then in 1658, with Cromwell dead and his son not really supported, the Rump had to be recalled because someone had to rule England after some manner or another. And then in 1660, the entire Long Parliament was recalled. And it did things in order to recall monarchy to the country. Well, that's a story for next week's lecture. Now, to focus on what took place with and to the Church of England during this interregnum period, during this period without a king, and also this period of civil war. Well, during the English Civil War, there were 2 sides. One was the royalist side, which was represented by the King, Charles, by his bishops of the Church of England, by the Church of England clergy, many of them, and by those who supported the royalist cause. On the other hand were the parliamentary forces, which were originally Presbyterian, but then also included independents, and most important, Cromwell and his new model army. All those who feared Rome and the reintroduction of Roman Catholicism within England, they were on the parliamentary sources, and then also all those who believed in a new concept or a new interpretation of the concept of personal freedom and personal conscience ruling individuals with matters of religion and matters of politics. And Oliver Cromwell was a representative of this general mindset. So individual conscience and no one telling them what to do. And so those were the 2 sides roughly encapsulated that fought during the English Civil War. Now, in 1643, again to solicit the help of the Presbyterians and the Scottish army from the north, the Parliament engaged in a solemn league and covenant with the Presbyterians and the Scots from Scotland. Now, in this solemn league and covenant, it had very important religious overtones, because in it, the English Parliament agreed to get rid of bishops entirely. They weren't to be in the church and they weren't to be in the House of Lords. Bishops were to be gone permanently. And so that meant that the government of the church by bishops was also going to be gone too, and a Presbyterian system of church government was to be introduced. Now, in order to make everybody in the nation comply with this, there was an oath which every male 18 years of old in all of England had to take, agreeing to the Solemn League and Covenant, which got rid of episcopacy and also got rid of the king and also got rid of the Book of Common Prayer. Now, there were 2,000 to 3,000 out of the roughly 10,000 Anglican clergy, or clergy within the Church of England, 2,000 to 3,000 which could not take this oath, and they were expelled. Even though money was supposed to be set aside to look after them and charitable donations were taken, the money didn't, in most cases, actually reach any of them, so they were out. Now, some of these clergy were able to flee to the continent, go into hiding within England, or become tutors and teachers to the members of the English nation who were still at heart Anglicans. They would tutor their children and act as personal chaplains to the household. Some of them were able to do that. Now, because a lot of the clergy were waverers, not really knowing what they should do under these circumstances, and not really wanting to be kicked out entirely, the Parliament set up committees to examine all the clergy to see whether or not they were suitable to be kept under this new Presbyterian system, under the Solemn League and Covenant, or whether or not they had to be expelled. And sometimes these examinations of the clergy went on for weeks, and the committee would make its final determination. Now, to give you a sense of the spirit of the age, in the 1640s, in 1644, the Parliament passed a law saying that the Book of Common Prayer was now illegal in England. Not only was it not to be used for church services, it was an illegal document which was to be burned and destroyed, and you weren't to be caught possessing it. And in its place, the Parliament and Presbyterians produced a directory of worship. Now, this mustn't be confused with the notion of another prayer book, because it was most definitely not that. This was a directory to the clergy as to how they were to conduct services. And the entire directory did not include one single prayer, not even the Lord's Prayer. So it was a directory of how to, or what things not to do, but it didn't include even a single prayer. So that meant the clergy had this directory, and meant that every clergyman in England that was still functioning and under the approval of the Parliament and the Solemn League and Covenant was going to make up services as he went along and as he saw best. And of course, not surprisingly, with the expulsion of all the bishops, also a Presbyterian form of church government was introduced, and it was to be enforced. And these forces, of course, with their committees, etc., were busy enforcing it. Now, this led the famous individual John Milton to exclaim, "The new presbyter is but the old priest writ large." That is, those who didn't agree with this, either because they were Church of England or were of a different Protestant persuasion, were under the thumb of those in charge. Now, this created a great deal of space within the English nation for new ideas to arise, new ideas in the sphere of religion. Now, it gave rise to the Congregationalists within England, that is, those who thought that the unit of Christian organization was to be the congregation and the congregation only. It was its own church. It would elect or appoint its own minister, and that was it. It may associate with other congregations, but there was no higher organization within Christianity than the congregation. It also gave rise to a new group that was not liked by anybody, particularly not by the Presbyterians, and these were known as the Anabaptists. They would later give rise to the Baptist denomination, but at this period of history they were despised, and they were known as the Anabaptists because Ana means again. They baptized individuals again as adults. They despised infant baptism, and they would rebaptize individuals as adults. And this was despised by basically everyone else in the Christian spectrum. Also, this time period gave rise to Quakers, the coming into existence of what would later become known as the Quaker denomination. And it's very important to notice that, particularly with the Baptists and the Quakers especially, these didn't come full-blown denominations just all of a sudden appeared, but these were the nascent, the seminal beginnings of the individuals and groupings which would later become known as the Baptists and the Quakers. Also, there were more extreme extreme varieties known as the Fifth Monarchist men, who were millenarians. That is, they believed in the 1,000-year reign of Christ upon earth, and they were acting and preaching in an attempt to bring it about. There were also the Sabbatarians that came into existence. This was a small group that said, Sunday's wrong day of worship, Saturday is the Sabbath, and it is the day for Christian worship. Also, there's another group known in the history as the Levelers. And these are people who were sort of proto-Marxists. They thought that the problem of society was the classes and the different structures within British society, and they wanted to level it all, an egalitarian social movement inspired by their understanding of the gospel. And then finally, most extreme perhaps, were the Diggers. They were ones who thought that what needed to be done is everybody's land needed to be plowed up and it had to be seeded, and if everybody had food in common, that would solve so many of the problems and meet some of the injunctions found by our Lord and found in the pages of the New Testament, known as the Diggers, because they dig up anybody's land and plant on it. So this religious turmoil that existed during this time period between 1640 and 1660 created a space within which these new groupings would arise. The main ones, however, were the Presbyterians, who were in charge at first for the first few years, and then the Independents, because they were the core of the New Model Army, which won the battles, defeated the king, and arrested him, and then eventually executed him. They were the ones who had power in state and church, and they were led by Oliver Cromwell. Now, the other thing that happened during this interregnum period was that there was an intentional and systematic destruction of all externals in religion that those in charge, the Presbyterians first, but then the Independents, thought were smacked of popery or of traditional Christianity. And this meant destroying all vestments, all church ornaments, all prayer books, and stained glass windows. Now, there was a fair amount of spoliation that took place during the time of Henry VIII and his son Edward, but this was a new phase of it. And there were people who went throughout the realm of England destroying these things within all churches and cathedrals. And I was in England on sabbatical a number of years ago in the Norwich area, and there were wonderful medieval cloth industry churches that were built in the late Middle Ages, the 14th and 15th century, parish churches that had stained glass windows that were up so high you had to look like that in order to tilt your head to see them, 30 feet plus up in the air. And there were special men who went out to those places with long, long poles and smashed out every pane in those stained glass windows. And in some instances, there were hundreds of panes in the window over the west end of the church, and they were all smashed out. And these men thought they were doing God's work when they did it. Also, wood carvings on pews and in choir stalls that dated from the Middle Ages were hacked to pieces using swords and axes. It gives you some sort of sense of the extraordinary level of destruction, all in the name of religion, of Christian churches that took place during this time. But all was not lost, because some of the Anglican Church clergy who went into hiding, they kept the flame of traditional prayer book Anglicanism alive within the nation of England, and they bided their time, because it was somewhat apparent that due to the extraordinary turmoil and instability of the period, that this could not persist. And they looked for a better day, and they taught the faith, and they used the prayer book secretly. They educated an upcoming generation of men who they hoped would be leaders, and they kept the flame of traditional Anglicanism alive during this time period. One of the big problems they had, of course, was that the bishops were getting older over this 20-year time period, and they were running short on bishops to ordain new clergy in the future. But enough did survive in order to transmit apostolic succession. Now, unfortunately, to conclude our story, even after he was defeated militarily in the English Civil War, Charles I continued to conspire to attempt to raise armies and foreign help in order to fight against the new model army of Cromwell yet again. And then finally, conflict arose again in 1647. The Royalist forces were again defeated, and this time the king was arrested. This time, Cromwell determined there could be no peace in the realm as long as that man's head stayed on his shoulders. This time, the king was tried. This time, he was beheaded publicly on the 30th of January in 1649. Now, despite his belief in the divine right of kings, despite his conspiring to continue the English Civil War, King Charles I behaved very nobly at the time of his arrest and trial and execution, so much so that many who hated him admired his perseverance to the end. And indeed, when his head was cut off, the soldiers cheered, but the crowd was shocked and silent. And instead of extinguishing royalty within England, Cromwell, by this rash behavior, actually guaranteed its return. The public was not on line with killing the king, and actually Charles became a martyr for the cause of royalty, for the cause of constitutional monarchy, for the cause of prayer book Anglicanism within the English nation, and it would rise again. And interestingly, from the Restoration period, which we'll talk about next week, until the middle of the 19th century, there was a special service in the Book of Common Prayer commemorating the death of King Charles I and treating him as close as is possible within Anglicanism to a martyr or a saint for the cause of the Church of England within the realm. But that, my friends, is a story for our next lecture. Thank you.